Hearing you talk about habits that way makes me compare two activities I like very much and contrast the challenges of learning each of them. So one is riding a bike and the other is learning to swim. So if you took um, a 20-year-old who had never done both, and admittedly, it's easy to find a 20-year-old that's never swum. It's probably hard to find a 20-year-old that's never ridden a bike. But I would posit that it's really easy to teach a 20-year-old to ride a bike if they haven't done it. And let's assume for a moment this isn't someone who had never been able to do it before, but you sort of found somebody who'd never ridden a bike at 20. And the reason I would argue that is in a bike, the object is balance, right? It's really about balance. And you get your feedback immediately. So you know the second you're out of balance on a bike because you're in the environment of the air. And the air has a density such that it's not forgiving. You basically are out of balance, you're going to fall. Conversely, although most people don't think of it this way, swimming is also about balance in the water. You're trying to balance yourself this way versus this way. Most people would naturally sink feet first, and you're trying to balance yourself this way so that you can breathe. And those things are not easy to do because the feedback loop is very long and it's very hard to make the connection that you're out of balance. It also doesn't hurt as much when you fail. So when you fall off your bike, it's very uncomfortable. But when you're out of balance in swimming, you just have to work harder, but you don't realize why you're working harder. Anyway, that's why I think it's very hard to learn how to swim and it's not very hard to learn how to ride a bike. And therefore, it requires much more deliberate practice to learn to swim than it does to ride a bike, at least at some basic level.
That's a fascinating question. It's really good. It raises a lot of interesting details about why we form habits and how they form. So first, I'll kind of give a roundabout answer here, but I'll come back to your question. So what is it that determines whether a habit is good or bad? You know, we use these phrases a lot of the time in conversation. We say, oh, it's a bad habit, it's a good habit. And sometimes people will ask me like, well, why do I repeat this habit if it's bad for me? You know, if it's so terrible, then how come I keep coming back to it? And I think we can divide, you know, in a sense, some, you know, if you want to get really pedantic about it or really academic about it, some researchers don't even like to use the word good or bad because they're habits and they all serve you in some way.
So we could just say basically adaptive or maladaptive.
Right. Yeah. And I think we could make a meaningful division in the sense of how we use it in most conversation and say that pretty much all behaviors produce multiple outcomes across time. And broadly speaking, we could lump it into an immediate bucket, an immediate outcome, and an ultimate outcome. And what you find is that for most bad habits, the immediate outcome is actually pretty favorable. Like, you know, the classic example is smoking a cigarette. But if you smoke a cigarette outside the office at 10 a.m. with a friend, well, then immediately you get some socialization. Maybe it curbs your nicotine craving or just lets you like de-stress for a couple minutes or get a break from work. There are all kinds of things that you might be benefiting from. It's only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that the ultimate outcome is negative. With the good habits, especially the first time you perform them, it's often the reverse. Like the first week of training in the gym, your body looks the same in the mirror, you're sore, you don't really have much to show for the effort that you're putting in. You feel kind of stupid in there. You're wondering if people judge you or if you're doing it the wrong way. There are a lot of upfront costs, and it's only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that you get the outcome that you're looking for. And so in a sense, the cost of your good habits is in the present. The cost of your bad habits is in the future. And that misalignment between when you feel rewarded and when you feel punished helps to explain why we tend to fall pretty easily into a lot of things that we would categorize as bad, like eating donuts or smoking a cigarette or whatever, and fall less easily into things that we would categorize as good, or, you know, it feels like I have to force myself to write or whatever. Now, that's very similar to what you just mentioned about this, like the immediacy of the feedback. You know, bad habits are giving you pretty immediate feedback, kind of like riding a bike. Good habits are giving you pretty delayed feedback, maybe, you know, a little bit analogous to swimming. I think that example of the medium that you're in, air versus water, is fascinating to think about water as being like a feedback dampener. But there is another element to it, which you also mentioned, which is the strength of the feedback. So, you know, falling on the ground off a bike and skinning your knee is like pretty painful. You learn quite quickly. Technically, making a bad stroke in the water, you don't really pay too much of a cost if you're being sloppy with your form. And so it's unlikely that you rectify that quickly. And this is a phenomenon that I think is so critical or so important to behavior change. I called it the cardinal rule of behavior change in Atomic Habits, which is behaviors that get immediately rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that get immediately punished get avoided. And it's really about the speed and the intensity of that feedback. And generally speaking, the quicker you can get feedback and the more, too intense is maybe a bit much, but at some point it needs to be high enough to move the needle. It can't be so low that, it doesn't register. So you need both meaningful feedback and quick feedback if you want behavior to change.
Yeah. And well, actually, I want to come back to that topic because I think therein lies one of the themes of your book, right? Which is that willpower is not a great long-term strategy.